I pointed out in my two previous talks that patience is an aspect of the character of God and of Christ, and it is to be reproduced in all Christians, especially those who are in Christian ministry, that it's a mark of strength and not of weakness, and that it's expressed very often in that simple act, I was going to say, but it really isn't an act, it's a simple inaction of waiting. I think, especially in our modern Western world, we're so keyed to being active that we can't even begin to believe that inaction is sometimes the right course. And yet patience actually leads us to inaction. Now, today I'm going to explain how patience leaves the initiative with God. That's extremely important. First of all, let's see it exemplified in the ministry of Jesus. John 5:19, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, unless it is something he sees the Father doing. For whatever the Father does, these things the Son also does in like manner." That really is a pattern for all who are in Christian ministry. In fact, for all Christians. Jesus said, in effect, I never preempt the Father. I never take the initiative out of the Father's hand. I never do something on my own until I've seen the Father do it, until I have his example before me, his pattern, his authorization. A little further on in John chapter 5, verse 30, Jesus returns to this theme, and he says, I can do nothing on my own initiative. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just or righteous or correct, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. So Jesus again says, I leave the initiative to the Father. I only do what he directs me to do, what I see exemplified in him. And he says, particularly in the matter of judgment, my judgment is just, it's correct, it's trustworthy, because I do not seek my own will, but the will of him who sent me. You see, that reveals the real root error of impatience is seeking your own will. And once you seek your own will and take the initiative out of the hands of God, you are no longer trustworthy in your judgment. You make foolish, hasty, rash, inaccurate judgments, and you pay the price. So believe me, it pays to cultivate patience in the matter of judgment. And then this is exemplified in the attitude of Jesus concerning his friend Lazarus. The report was brought to him that Lazarus was sick, desperately sick, and this is how Jesus responded. When therefore he heard that he was sick, he stayed then 2 days longer in the place where he was. That's very strange, isn't it? He knew he had the power to heal. If he hadn't been directed by the Father, he would have just raced off immediately and reached Lazarus before he died. But the Father restrained him. The Father, I believe, revealed to him that he had a higher purpose. And so he waited 2 days, and when he got there, Lazarus had been dead 4 days. That's very hard to understand. I'm sure some of his disciples, and even Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, in their hearts, almost criticized Jesus. Why didn't he help us? And that's another aspect of being patient. Sometimes your friends and the people close to you will misunderstand your patience. But be encouraged. There's one person who understands, and that's God himself. You see, that the real problem with impatience is it takes the initiative from God. And so he's no longer responsible. When we act out of impatience, God cannot accept responsibility for our actions. He'll do his best for us. He'll follow us up and clean up the mess, maybe. But he is not responsible for anything that we do out of impatience. And this is primarily a question of timing. It's not sufficient to do the right thing. What you have to do is do the right thing at the right time. Here are a number of scriptures on this theme. James 1:19 and 20. But let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. You know, I meet scores of people who are just the other way around. They're quick to speak, but slow to hear. And there's a whole lot of things they never hear, and a whole lot of lessons they never learn. James goes on, for the anger of man does not achieve the righteousness of God. And then in Proverbs 15:23, a man has joy in an apt answer, and how delightful is a timely word. The King James Version says, a word in season. Do you know it's possible to say exactly the right thing, but spoil it all by saying it at the wrong moment? Oh, how many times we have that problem. Isn't that true? I'd like to read also a rather longer passage in Ecclesiastes chapter 3, which emphasizes the tremendous importance of right timing. This is really one of my favorite passages in the Bible. A lot of people don't read Ecclesiastes, but I tell you, you're missing something if you never read it. This is the first 8 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. There is an appointed time for everything. Notice that, everything. And there is a time for every event under heaven. And then there's this long list. A time to give birth and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to tear down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. A time to throw stones and a time to gather stones. A time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. Isn't that an example of patience? When you just have to say, I've got to recognize this thing is lost, it's gone. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. You see, if I remember rightly, there are 18 opposites there. None of them is always right, and none of them is always wrong. Each is right at the right time and wrong at the wrong time. And what is required to achieve the right timing, one essential requirement, is patience, being willing to wait. Then you see the opposite of patience, impatience, leads to something which is very harmful, emotionally, mentally, physically. Perhaps one of the greatest causes of sickness of all kinds today. It's fretting. This is what David says in Psalm 37, verses 7 through 9. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. It would be worthwhile counting sometime how many times David talks about waiting for the Lord. I believe that's one of the great secrets of his strength. Rest in the Lord and wait patiently for him. Listen, if you're impatient, you cannot rest. Fret not yourself because of him who prospers in his way, because of the man who carries out wicked schemes. You remember, God's patience causes him not to intervene immediately against the wicked, but to wait for the right time. Cease from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it leads only to evil doing. For evildoers will be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord, notice the emphasis on waiting again, those who wait for the Lord, they will inherit the land. See, that's the basis of patience, that if we wait, we'll inherit. But if we're hasty, we may miss our inheritance. There's a destructive sequence that occurs in the lives of most of us, and I have to tell you, I've learnt this from personal experience. It goes this way. Impatience leads to irritability, which leads to anger. And very often, especially if we're trying to be good Christians, we suppress that anger. But I'm not sure that in the long run, suppressed anger doesn't do more harm than expressed anger. And it's expressed later in hastiness. Let me say that again. Let me give you that sequence. Impatience, irritability, anger frequently suppressed, and it issues in hastiness. Listen to these words from Proverbs, which has got a lot to say about this. Proverbs 19:2. Also it is not good for a person to be without knowledge, and he who makes haste with his feet errs. See, the implication is that to acquire knowledge, you've got to be patient. But if you're hasty with your feet, you'll take a wrong course. Proverbs 21:5. The plans of the diligent lead surely to advantage or prosperity, but everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. Isn't that an amazing statement? Everyone who is hasty comes surely to poverty. I'm not a businessman, but I have many acquaintances who are, and I think one sure way to failure in business is to be hasty, to go ahead of your timing and your judgment. Then again, Proverbs 29 and verse 20. Do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. When I read those words once, they shocked me. I thought the Bible has nothing whatever good to say about a fool. But it says a man who is hasty in his words is worse than a fool. He has less hope than a fool. Brothers and sisters, we have to cultivate patience. If we want to succeed, if we want God's blessing, if we want our inheritance, we have to cultivate patience.